This is my instrument. This is called a touch style Veena. Let's see if we can get it better. Now you can actually see the whole thing. There you go. And it actually, I have to strap it on from a fairly complicated set of straps and cords and so forth. But I play it by tapping my fingers on the strings. And because you play it by tapping, you can actually play a part with each hand. So I actually play two parts at the same time. One of the things I do, because Indian music is, of course, mainly a monophonic music, but there is this tradition called jugalbandi, where two melody instruments play together. So I do jugalbandi with myself, basically. One hand will answer and then the other hand will go back and I'll go back and I'll do the kind of trading and so forth. And each hand sounds very different. These strings are very thin and loose, and these are very thick and tight, and these are wound and these are unwound. So it really does sound like two different instruments. This sounds more or less like a bass, and this one sounds more like, well, sort of like a guitar. It actually does sound like a South Indian Veena a fair amount, but the playing technique is completely different. Because
are you going to play for us, or are we just going to? This is all in theory.
I think probably the best thing for the playing would be, to just have people go to my website, bollywoodgharana.com.
Yes, of course.
There are videos there. There are several videos of me playing there, and I think I can do a better job under that circumstance than I can under this circumstance.
All right. I have spent as much time now in the US as I have growing up in India.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things that I realized was the complete freedom, right? When you get to this country, because there's no 5,000 years of civilization and expectations of you. Mm-hmm. And I loved what you said about that there are rules and traditions in India, right? Mm-hmm. That set the artist free. Whereas in the US, there are no rules and traditions, but then that leaves the artist spiritually untethered.
I mean, in the West, you have a lot of interest in Orientalism, in the Orient, in the East, and particularly because I grew up as a hippie in the 60s, I was really, really interested in trying to come up with an alternative to Christianity, which I was not really, and to Western culture in general. But what I begin to find out is that, if you talk about any generalization that includes both Punjabis and Koreans, is clearly not going to be talking about anything where there's going to be any overlap. That there's tremendous differences between South Asians and East Asians. Now, I spend a lot more time with South Asians than I have with East Asians, but I was really struck when I wrote my articles. People always said, the traditions, never change. And people would say, that's the problem with India, that they need to be able to change their traditions and so forth. But every time you got to somebody, I actually studied somebody who supposedly was preserving the tradition, they were always changing it. There was just nobody who was just doing it the same way. And so there was, I think, more freedom in India than people generally give credit. And I think even more credit than Indians give themselves for this, too. I mean, there is a sense, yes, you do have those rules, but the fact of the matter is, if you break the rules, people will scream at you and yell at you, and maybe they won't even talk to you for like 5 years. But eventually, people accept these kind of changes. Indians do accept changes, and they're willing. I think there's a willingness and even an eagerness to think outside the box. There's a natural creativity that Indians are individualistic, and that's why I did this thing about the cowboy and the yogi. That's why the book is called The Cowboy and the Yogi, because the yogi is totally an individualist. The yogi is sitting on, somewhere meditating. And yes, the yogi has a guru, but the guru, you end up following the guru in different ways. There is a saying that the guru is like the sun, best appreciated from afar, right? So, you do have a position where you go through this kind of training, but then you always have to go through a period of throwing it off. And every Indian artist I studied, and I interviewed and did research on dozens, maybe even hundreds of artists, over my time when I was in India Currents, and there was never anybody who wasn't changing the tradition. They were always, they would preserve it, but they would change it at the same time.
Yes.
And I think this having rules that you break, trying to operate without rules, I think is a real problem. But having rules and recognizing that sometimes you have to recognize that the rules, be broken, is a real important characteristic. And and you do find this in America too. There is a passage in Huckleberry Finn, which I actually quote in one of my articles in India Currents, where Huck is stuck between, he is told he has to bring Jim back because Jim is a slave, and he's making some terrible, he's performing an act of theft because he's taking Jim away, but his gut tells him that slavery is wrong, and so he ends up saying, "Okay, I'll go to hell," and then he takes Jim with him instead of taking him back for the thing. And I think that particular attitude of letting your intuition be more important than the rules, I see that in Indians time and time again. I'm starting to write an article about somebody who's supposed to be a traditionalist, and then you discover they changed the tradition. That's probably the theme that runs through almost every single article in the book.
Yeah, and any classical tradition in India, it is a very solo path. It's your pursuit, a personal, intensely intimate and solo pursuit of the divine.
Yes.
Right? In any classical tradition in India. And I feel like the title of your book, cowboys, lone rangers. I think you also kind of allude to it.
Yes.
And the yogi.
Cowboy is the lone ranger. Yes.
Right. Solo, right? I found that fascinating, and I immediately kind of knew what you were referring to, right? Which is what completely caught my attention. But, one thing that struck me was your choice of the word ambivalent, right? When it comes to Indians, you said Indians are ambivalent to tradition, and therefore India will have a future, or Indian traditions will have a future because but ambivalent was a very interesting choice of word.
Understand the word ambivalent, it means, yes and no. It's like being both attracted and afraid at the same time. And I do think that is the attitudes. Indians often feel guilty about breaking traditions, but they do it anyway.
Right.
And but at the same, but ultimately it's a feeling that you're not supposed to do it. You are supposed to break the rules, and none of the rules. I think part of it has to do with the idea that you can't expect everything to operate the way you're supposed to have. But India is a country with so many surprises, so many hidden variables, that you just can't trust any long range plans to work. You have to be flexible, to deal with. There's so many different people, so many different traditions, so many different languages. You've got to be able to roll with the punches. Now, okay, I speak here as somebody who has never actually been to India. I'm going to change that. I'm going to get.
And yet, you say you're going to be more comfortable in Calcutta than in Georgia.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And of course, I feel more comfortable because I spend so much time with Indians. In America and California, I go to places, I go to concerts where most of the people are Indians, and my writing and so forth. I wrote for this magazine for like 25 years, so. Yeah, I become Indian, but most of the Indians I know are suspended between the two cultures just the same way I am. That is, they came from one direction and I came from the other direction, and we meet in the middle.
Yes.
That's pretty much what happened. No, actually, yes. This is pretty much, this article, actually, Vandana asked me to write this on the 25th anniversary of India Currents. She asked several of the, I guess, senior columnists, I guess I have to say. I guess I am a senior these days. There's no getting around that. Asking one of the senior, to just tell about, how you got into there and what your experience was being with them. So this was the article I wrote for that 21st anniversary. So this is from the introduction to the book, Cowboy and the Yogi. When I first came to the Bay Area, I knew only one thing about India. Its music was amazing. Critics would often refer to these astonishing structures of melody and rhythm as ethnic music. And of course, I knew I was more likely to get hired playing at Indian restaurants than anywhere else. Nevertheless, even though I knew where this music came from geographically, I didn't really experience it as coming from anywhere in particular. For me, it existed in a kind of abstract possibility space, like gravity, numbers, and justice, profoundly beautiful and beyond any one location in space and time. To some degree, I still believe that. But India Currents taught me to love the culture as much as the music it produced. Can I sum up a few fundamental principles of what I learned after 15 years of monthly columns? I can try. Despite lightly held stereotypes, India, like America, is a country that feeds and nourishes creative individuality. Just as Americans have been inspired by the archetype of the cowboy who wanders the open spaces in search of a dream, so Indians are inspired by the yogi who wanders inner spaces in search of realization. The essential difference between the two cultures is that America believes in making up the rules as you go along, and India is a country with lots of rules and traditions. What the Indian stereotype ignores, however, is that Indians are more than willing to break those rules when it seems necessary. Many Indians see this as a weakness, which causes corruption and inability to make trains run on time. I believe, however, that this is one of India's greatest strengths. The American view of rules creates a society which is often spiritually rootless and addicted to novelty for its own sake. The Indian view of rules creates a society which is in constant flux, but not one that is fragmented and cut off from its past. Most of the Indian musicians I have interviewed have said the music they play is thousands of years old and their only goal is to preserve the tradition. However, any comparison between those musicians and their gurus always reveals extensive innovations in melodic and rhythmic material, playing technique, even in the construction of the instrument itself. Indians always speak as if obedience tradition was their highest priority. But when push comes to shove, it's always the inner voice of intuition that wins out. An intuition that at its best inspires each individual to preserve the essence of the tradition as he or she changes it. Indians may be embarrassed by, and non-Indians skeptical of, such effusive praise from an outsider. While I am talking about stereotypes, I realize that I embody a stereotype myself. The starry-eyed Westerner who completely loses himself in some other culture. Gilbert and Sullivan mocked this character as the idiot who praises with enthusiastic tone every century but this and every country but his own. India attracts a lot of people of this sort, and I do count myself among them. However, I try to put my own spin on this stereotype in two ways. First of all, I'm more attracted these days to the similarities between my own culture and India's, partly because I've discovered that the difference was not as great as I once thought, and partly because I've been changed by the culture as I've studied it. These days, I would probably feel more at home in Kolkata than in Idaho or Georgia, despite the fact that the latter are politically part of my native country. Secondly, unlike many Western Indophiles, I'm not afraid of India changing. I know that modernization is not the same as Westernization, that Bollywood movies are as uniquely Indian as raga and yoga. India's uniquely ambivalent attitude to tradition and change will ensure that the India of tomorrow will be as Indian in its own way as the India of the Guptals and the Mughals. That is why I am interested in how India's past transforms into India's future.
I love how you've demystified it down, and you can't carry the baggage from how you understand one type of music into the appreciation of another.
Because they're parameters. Every music varies along certain parameters. And the parameter that Western music varies on is the interactions between the various parts. For example, if a European classical musician wants a different tone color, he puts two different dots on a piece of paper and tells the oboes to play this and the flutes to play that, and then he gets a different tone color that way. But if an Indian musician wants to get a different tone color, he bends the string a different way, or he plucks the string in a different way, or he shapes his mouth a different way, on the embouchure of a horn or a flute, and you can get as great a variety that way. Mm-hmm. But if what you're listening for is interacting parts, you're going to keep saying, well, where's the change? It all sounds the same. Everybody says it all sounds the same. And, what I have tried to do is to teach people to, just be aware of that. So when you start to be bored, you're realizing you're listening along the wrong parameter, But ultimately, I think, what I tried to do is, and why my book is different from an awful lot of other books on Indian music, is that it's not like a technical text where people, you're supposed to know all this technical language when you go in. I assume that the people I'm writing for don't know anything about Indian music and try to compare it to other styles. Because I grew up in the West, I was playing rock and jazz and country, and I know something about European classical music. I sang in choirs and so forth. I spent a lot of time listening to it. But I try to start with styles of music for people who are not familiar with Indian music and get them to understand, why, I mean, like I have one of my articles, I explain why Drupad is really more like Haydn or Mozart, and Kayal is more like Wagner or Brahms. It's just that there's, or Beethoven, where there's just more ornamentation, more richness. And when you learn how to listen for those things, you can appreciate that a little better.
So how, a little dive into your personality.
Sure.
How old were you when you first, why and how did you come to hear Indian music?
Okay. I mean, how old was I when I started listening to Indian music?
Yes.
Okay. I was, well, I heard a little bit of it, when the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's came out.
Oh, right, of course.
And I thought that was pretty cool. That was 1967, right? And I thought that was pretty cool. I wasn't, but I had this one record, right, which everybody in the 60s had. It had this picture of a kaleidoscope on the front with weird stuff on it. And it was Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar playing in Bhairavi, and everybody, this was when you were smoking dope, this was the album that you listened to. But the thing that really got me interested in it, rather than feeling that this was just sort of like some sort of meditation stool, was John McLaughlin's group Shakti.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an amazing experience for me. I went expecting to hear a loud electric band, and they were actually warming up for Weather Report. So Weather Report's instruments were all set up behind Shakti. And Shakti was sitting on these rugs playing, on the floor, right, with all acoustic instruments. And Zakir Hussain, the first time I ever saw Zakir Hussain, and Selva Ganesh and El Shankar and John McLaughlin himself playing. And we kept thinking, the people I was with said, well, he's going to do this for about 20 minutes. Then they're going to get up and they're going to play those big electric instruments, right? And that never happened. At a certain point, this is it, right? You're going to have to stay here and listen to these acoustic instruments. So you sat down and you listened to them. And by the end of the thing, I was totally transfixed. And this was the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. McLaughlin and everybody else in the band got a standing ovation. And I went out and bought my first set of tablas. And then I started feeling I've got to study this. And then the woman who I'm now married to, when she said, well, I want to go out to California. The thing that did it for me was I knew that Ali Akbar's school was here.
Yes.
And I said, I will study with it. I was sure if I can study with Ali Akbar, Diana, if you want to go out to California, we can go out to California. And then when I actually started studying this music, I discovered all the things I liked about McLaughlin's music were already in Indian music. He hadn't invented those. He had just gotten them all from Indian music. And that when I realized, wow, this is and then I started really seriously studying with Ali Akbar. My first classes were probably in like 87, I think something like that. I came out here in 83. Diana and I came out here in 83. And I poked around for a little while. I've actually just been re-recording my tapes. I thought I'd started about 85, but it looks like my first tape goes back to about 87. So then I took about 100 classes with Ali Akbar. And I was performing a little bit, performing in restaurants, trying to practice up my my ragas. There was a restaurant called the Ganges in San Francisco, a vegetarian restaurant. And I played there for years. Dear Malvi Doshi was like my West Coast mother, terrific cook. And, was very supportive of my music. But I began to, as I practiced this music more and more, I started submitting press releases about my music to India Currents, and they kept printing them, which was very nice. And then eventually, they actually commissioned me to write an article.
Right.
And they liked that article, and then they started commissioning more articles. And then at a certain point, it was when Arvind Kumar retired and Ashok took over as a publisher. They said, look, we need to have a ready stream of articles. So, we'd like you to write a monthly column. Yeah. So I wrote a monthly column, and it was I was one step ahead of myself. As I say in one of the articles, I was an expert in the sense of, the definition where you say it consists of two parts, X meaning an unknown quantity and spurt meaning a drip under pressure. I was an unknown drip under pressure.
Right. Turns out that it's basically a collection of previous writings, but not just a collection. You have discerned that there is a pattern to them. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, what I've done is this theme of the cowboy and the yogi had been running through my head for some time. I had seen, it did first occur to me, I'd had it in the back of my mind before Bandana even commissioned that article. But I thought, my continual surprise that this culture, which was supposed to be so tradition bound, was so constantly making innovations. And it wasn't just in the articles I was writing; it was the articles I was reading in India Currents too. That's the first time I learned about the woman in India who invented, who got people in prisons to meditate. Thinking of that, how outside the box is that? That was brilliant. And to say nothing that they had a woman running a prison too. When is that's going to happen in the United States? Probably not that often, right? Mm-hmm. And just constantly seeing these innovations that Indians were doing. And so I ran it through that, but I also, grouping it in sections, I basically wanted to make it so that all the articles about a given topic would work. So